In the last two deep dives, I've made the statement that Games Workshop's minis are in an awkward spot right now, down to a bunch of reasons, but epitomized by the availability of 3D resin printers. In today's video, we're going to take a much deeper dive into that specific threat, including whether or not it'll get better or worse for Games Workshop in the future. As always, get nice and comfortable. Heck, with the colder weather we've got above the equator, maybe swap out your glass of milk for a cup of nice hot chocolate. You comfortable? Good, let's begin. For once, we don't need too much of a history lesson, as I won't be rehashing Games Workshop's history this time around. If you do want a deeper dive into how we got here, do feel free to take a gander at my previous deep dives. I'll have them linked down below. The short version, however, is that Games Workshop spent over a decade angering and alienating its most ardent fans, but it was always kept afloat thanks to its sheer scale. The miniature gaming space and Games Workshop are effectively synonymous with one another, and they have made sure to use, or abuse, depending on one's outlook, their position to keep it that way. So when 3D printers began to pop into the media limelight almost a decade ago, it was of extremely little concern to Games Workshop or their investors. Those FDM printers were a country mile off of Games Workshop's quality level. The machines were awkward to use and prone to failed prints, and they were extraordinarily expensive for a hobbyist to even consider. Games Workshop, rather accurately for the era, didn't even consider the technology much of a threat and thus didn't bother fighting these niche little machines as a result. And heck, their community themselves, as angry as they were with Games Workshop, would laugh out anyone who showed up at a tournament with the horrifically jagged minis produced by 3D printing of the era. That leads us quite perfectly into our first analysis. How much of a threat was 3D printing to Games Workshop when it first popped up? Well, it was virtually no threat at all. Not unlike how one can conceivably build their own car and engine entirely from scratch, few people wanted to drop the substantial outlay for the tools, only to invest far more time for a far worse result. But where Games Workshop went wrong was in its hubris. While 3D printing was absolutely no threat to them at launch, like most technologies, it wouldn't stay stagnant for very long. While the launch 3D FDM printers were of no threat whatsoever, Games Workshop would realize to their horror that there was an issue they had completely failed to account for. Resin printers had hit the scene and their quality level was almost on par with what Games Workshop could manage, while the software had made the printing process notably easier and costs had come down to the point where a 3D printer and resin could be bought for less than the cost of even an entry-level Army and Warhammer. It was too late to put the genie back into the bottle now, and Games Workshop's reaction to this new era was as clumsy as it was late. Instead of relying on the community to deal with the printed armies, they would put rules in place specifically forbidding 3D printed models from appearing in Games Workshop's events. Ironically, even when Games Workshops themselves would no longer produce a purchasable model for the print in question. Takedown notices would be sent out before they realized they couldn't possibly take on all the 3D STLs out in the wild. And while Games Workshop has fought other companies, communities, and even its own fans before, it had always done so from a position of power. This more recent blitz was one of the first times a tinge of desperation seemed to betray their confidence. So, seeing as how Games Workshop was on the back foot a bit, one might naturally assume that the current 3D printers are a huge threat to Games Workshop. But as someone who uses a 3D printer on a daily basis for work, I'll say right now, 3D printing still currently kinda sucks. Of the two main technologies, FDM and resin, FDM's results are too poor to even bother considering, so from here on out, assume that any reference to 3D printing is in direct reference to resin printing. If the first wave of 3D printers were akin to the very first computers, then that puts today's current printers in roughly the MS-DOS era. Much like the initial PCs were beloved by certain hardcore enthusiasts, they were in no way a threat to the industry at the time. The public didn't want to learn codes and tricks to perform simple tasks when there were simple purchasable alternatives instead. No industry of that era was in danger of being replaced by DOS. Much like 3D printers these days, personal computers of that era were common enough to know someone who owned one, but the amount of households that actually had a computer in the late 80s was still a distinct minority. Likewise, while they were dipping their toes into new fields, for the most part, PCs were rarely the best option on the table for a solution. Now, you might think my assessment harsh, especially considering I just admitted that I use printers, multiple in fact, for work. But 3D printing has a litany of flaws that prevent it from currently threatening Games Workshop. For one, their scale relative to printing speed is laughably small. I don't have multiple printers because I need, multiple projects or they do specific niches. I have them because otherwise I'm looking at 8 hours to print a simple small part, which effectively would limit me to 2 printed parts per day. While the technologies have improved slightly since launch, it is still nowhere close to practical for printing an army as is. You would be looking at weeks worth of print for even the smallest reasonable army. And while we're on the subject of small, while prices have come down, size really hasn't gone up simultaneously. For any entry-level or even mid-range printer, you're looking at a maximum print size in roughly the half a foot range, or 15 centimeters. So any thoughts of printing Titans or Greater Demons or even most tanks can be shelved immediately. Moving up to a printer large enough to print those moves someone up into about the 4-figure range, and that's for the cheapest option available. So for most people currently, the option is either doing an all-infantry army or buying an FDM printer in addition to make lower quality large-scale units. After all that time investment, you're also looking at even more time trimming supports, washing the parts, curing them, and doing any other post-processing steps required. And despite how slow things go, the end user is still looking at a pretty miserable experience. Let's start with the obvious one that most people notice immediately with resin printers: the smell. Now, if you've got a garage, then this might mean precious little to you, but for anyone who needs the printer to stay inside, you're going to notice an awful scent. But there's a way bigger issue here that frequently gets ignored. 3D printer resin is dangerous stuff. Have a pet? You will need a hard division to keep them away. Have an open space? You're going to need to quarantine off an area because you will get resin on things. Have a limited area? You're going to need to figure out where you can print in a place that isn't too sunny, too warm, too damp, too cold, because you're going to have issues if it's any of those things. To be honest, considering how dangerous resin is, it's actually been pretty miraculous for 3D printers that those resins aren't more tightly controlled and regulated, but that's also not a guarantee that it'll stay that way forever. But even despite all of that, the resin itself also isn't something I expect most people, the general population, will tolerate. Resins are expensive and yet incredibly wasteful. Assuming everything goes perfectly, you're still looking at cutting off a good chunk of each print in the form of supports and wasted outside material, which are a whole separate issue that we'll discuss later. But that's also assuming everything goes well. You will have failed prints, especially when you're trying new models, and those failed prints are just even more plastic waste that the whole population has to deal with at some point. Resin is also very finicky, so failed prints, even on models you've printed before, are far from a rare occurrence. When the weather recently changed where I live, all of my prints began failing. I had to fail with prints for a few days before I could get everything back in line and printing again. That's without changing printers, changing files, or changing resins, because changing any of those 3 parameters will also bring you back to square one when it comes to figuring out supports, exposure times, lift speeds, and so on. And I've dodged around supports for a while now, but let's hit those head on. All of those supports remain an ongoing issue for current resin printers. While there is ideas in place for eliminating them in the future, as of right now, our best case scenario relies on sticking supports in any vulnerable location. Now, already this is a waste of material, which not only requires more cleanup and post-processing, but yet again contributes even more plastic waste than injection molds ever would. But worse still though, while I can put all of my supports inside of a part to hide over the leftover nubs and stuff like that, on something like a miniature, that isn't possible. The leftover plastic bits will be on the outside and they will be obvious, and you can also break off delicate pieces from the actual model during their removal. And then our last current issue, probably ironically for most people, is cost. While Commissar Gams' videos frequently claim printing costs down into the single digits, that's not really an honest cost. Virtually all of those prices can be safely doubled for a more accurate cost. What you're usually seeing there is the cost of the resin in the print, which completely ignores the costs of cleaning with IPA, which does disappear when you use it, electricity to run the 3D printer and any curing devices you use, tool wear, whatever the resin cost in the original printer reported, and it assumes that every print goes right in the first time. While one is almost assured to come in cheaper than Games Workshop's cost, the amount of casual fans who would be willing to drop hundreds on a 3D printer to print off only part of their army for a considerable amount of personal effort while committing half their waking day to each print and then accepting a significant failure rate on each part only to save a few bucks on each thing, well, there's a reason Games Workshop's bottom line hasn't missed a beat yet. Now, some of you are undoubtedly already rushing to the comments section to tell me precisely why I'm wrong, and why all these small issues are very easy to overcome and deal with. But before you press enter, I ask you, are you approaching this from the perspective of an enthusiast or from an average person? As an enthusiast, I agree with you. I'll tolerate and overcome the various issues of 3D printing because I personally enjoy it. But as an average person, 3D printers are out and out unacceptable for their issues, their consistency, and their barrier of entry. If you gave a 3D printer to your mother, to your neighbor, to your spouse, would they ever bother learning to use it and figure out its various quirks, or would it simply sit unused? So the past definitely wasn't ready for 3D printers, and the present still kind of isn't ready for them. Has Games Workshop effectively dodged this bullet then? Oh hell no, Games Workshop isn't safe in the future. Earlier I compared current resin printers to MS-DOS era computers, but for those of you who are too young to remember a pre-computer era, something very interesting happened in the mid-90s. Microsoft released Windows 95, an OS that introduced a graphical user interface, which suddenly meant that the vast majority of the population could perform simple tasks without needing to know how to run various command lines. This ease of use feature catapulted PCs from niche use hobbyist devices into mainstream devices, and they were so successful that there's virtually no industry not affected by computers at this point. This stemmed, as mentioned, from primarily making PCs easier to use, but it also helped massively drive down the cost of PCs. Computers had come down from an average of $2,200 in the mid-80s, down to $1,200 in the mid-90s, falling to $800 in the mid-noughts, and down to $540 in the mid-teens. Whereas most things suffered from massive inflation over the last 40 years, computers have actually depreciated by a substantial amount. Those numbers I gave were not adjusted for inflation. Many of the current problems with resin printers either already have solutions on the horizon, or at the very least have current research being looked into. Biocompatible resins have already reached the market, and they are expected at some point to out and out replace conventional resins, which will mitigate issues regarding safety and to a certain degree scent. And a few of the higher end printers have substantially quicker printing times, so we'll likely see that technology trickle down into the consumer space in not too long. And with laser projectors becoming more and more common in the audiovisual space, we're also likely not too far off of large build volumes becoming the standard rather than the exception. But two different research projects would be what would likely take 3D printers from a hobbyist device to a mainstream device. First up, from Germany comes the two-cure process, which effectively uses a wax rather than a resin, so the part is printed layer by layer, but it's printed from the opposite perspective of current standards. It goes from the bottom up rather than the top down, with each layer completely supporting the layer above it. Only the cured part survives the next step, which kind of washes off the wax material, which would be a huge win. Supports are a nightmare for the average person to deal with. The other interesting research project comes from Korea, where a ceramic nanocomposite mixture was found to not only be strong enough to be self-supporting, but also required effectively no cleanup, thanks to the composites not wanting to support uncured resin from sticking, while the cured resin was made noticeably stronger than conventional resins. Between those two technologies, printers could get to the point of being entirely plug-and-play devices, much like PCs were made to be, or to a lesser degree, much like modern printers are. If that happens, Games Workshop is pretty much dead in the water, or at least as far as the miniatures go. While some fans might be willing to put in the work to deny Games Workshop any profits, most people still aren't willing to make all the sacrifices required to print off their own armies. But being able to print off entire armies in the span of a week, if that had no failures and required no additional steps beyond just hitting print, well, that would be something the majority of the fan base would do, as we've seen in the past with the music industry versus Napster. Now, the real question is if these technologies are coming soon or not, or frankly, if they're even coming at all. 2Cure made its announcement 4 years ago, and yet two-stage resins still haven't disrupted the scene. Heck, you still can't even buy the two-stage resins, even from 2Cure themselves. And while researchers for the ceramic nanocomposites have only made their announcement 2 years ago, Nanoparticles tend to be very slow to come to market. Graphene superconductors took several decades to come to market after discovery as a point of reference. So I don't think we'll see that technology arrive until some point into the next decade in the best case scenario personally. If they don't arrive anytime soon, then I truly think Games Workshop has a chance to adapt and survive. If they do come to market pretty quick though, Games Workshop simply isn't stable enough to survive the gutting of 90% of their profits. They would fold in extremely short order if that happened. But let's assume that the stars align and suddenly Games Workshop can't rely on its miniature sales anymore. What happens to them, and also what happens to the miniatures market as a whole? Let's start with the worst case scenarios first so we can move on to more optimistic outlooks after. In the pessimistic take, Games Workshop survives but effectively just devolves entirely into patent trolls. Unable to make money on their miniatures and unwilling or unable to make money off of their other ventures, their primary means of income would be targeting anyone hosting Warhammer files, making a similar IP, or referencing the Warhammer IPs in any way, and relying on the income from that to keep them afloat. This wouldn't be too crazy for Games Workshop to pull off, as they were pretty notorious for doing exactly that in the past already. Games Workshop would see a colossal reduction in staff, as there'd be little point to developing new miniatures from that point forward, given that they couldn't make money off of it. And the IP itself would be entirely reliant on video games and novels to stay relevant, which would be a kind of precarious position for the company. Worse still, this would take down most of the miniatures market alongside them, as third-party bits makers would all fall alongside Games Workshop's lack of models, as they wouldn't be able to legally fill in the void left over. As for other manufacturers of tabletop models, they would still be in that precarious position of not wanting to threaten Games Workshop in any way, shape, or form, lest they face legal action, which would also keep the rest of the miniatures market down as well. Our second worst case scenario is that Games Workshop declares bankruptcy and its IPs and copyrights are bought up by another company. This could go brilliantly depending on who is doing the buying, but the vast majority of companies with deep enough pockets to buy up their IPs likely didn't get that big by being good people. In the most of the cases I've seen, when a dying company or a bankrupt company is bought up, it's either stripped of anything useful and absorbed, or it tends to fail all over again in very short order. Things don't go much better for the market in that case either. A large shakeup of that scale might leave a vacuum for another IP to move into, but more realistically, this would simply lead to a large reduction in tabletop players. For bits makers especially, this tumultuous period would be difficult, if not impossible, for them to survive. But those situations were a downer. Let's move on to greener pastures. Let's say Games Workshop sees the complete gutting of their miniatures coming, and thus reacts accordingly. Well, then things can get pretty interesting. With the community able to print in bulk, we would likely see Games Workshop start selling STLs and rules for all sorts of armies, which would be amazing for tabletop players. Imagine being able to field a whole battalion of units, limited only by your own patience to print and paint them all. Games Workshop would also be incentivized to create far more things more often. At the moment, every new creation from Games Workshop has a huge initial cost associated with it, because they need to be able to pay off the mold. But if the fan base is doing all the printing, Games Workshop simply wants to pump out as many STLs as possible so that the fans will continue to buy as much as possible. Now, this may or may not be good for the rest of the market. On the one hand, other companies would likely do the same when it comes to selling STLs, which several wargames already do, such as my own currently preferred wargame, Bloodfields. On the other hand, most bits makers would likely not survive, as anything that they could do, Games Workshop could do quicker and simply copyright claim to deny them that option. But then, let's look at the best case scenario for 3D printers. Games Workshop declares bankruptcy and folds without any buyer picking up their IPs. Now, I can already feel some of you hitting the caps locks on your keyboard, so let me explain. While this would leave workers at Games Workshop without a job and would likely ruin many people's portfolios, for the fanbase, this would be a gift from God. We need to get technical for a moment with our terms, because this will affect things. Games Workshop holds no relevant patents, and its trademarks would be entirely worthless at that point, i.e. the actual Games Workshop name. But most importantly for fans, because Games Workshop is a British company, its copyrights cannot be transferred and would thus no longer be attached to any legal entity. But what does that mean in just plain English? All of the Warhammer lore, designs, rules, and all of that stuff becomes open source. Imagine the community having the ability to design and upload units, with a community-maintained rule set, no restrictions on modding for either Games Workshop games or other games, no restrictions on fan animation, no restrictions on pretty much anything. This could be absolutely incredible for fans of the lore. While video games and novels would likely fall off the map, as companies wouldn't have a point of contact to gain permission from, the rest of the tabletop would likely endure just fine. And in case you're thinking this is some hypothetical, it isn't. When a company is bought out, its assets go to the new owner. So as an example, when THQ folded and THQ Nordic bought up all their assets, they got all of their IPs alongside with it. But when there is no buyer, those copyrights are effectively nullified. This is one of the reasons you can legally get Too Human completely free. Silicon Knights, the developer, are no longer around to enforce their ownership of it, and the license was never sold off prior to them folding for bankruptcy. So there's no one to tell Microsoft to not give it away for free in that particular instance. Now, this would be surprisingly beneficial for the industry as well. With Games Workshop out of the way, smaller companies would be able to fill in the vacuum left behind, and without fear of legal threats from Games Workshop's infamously zealous IP lawyers. Bitsmakers would also go from producing niche, no-name parts to being able to produce effectively anything they wanted, insignias and all. In fact, the only particular risk for anything comes from the same thing that all open source IPs have: money. When people are used to paying $0 for things, it's a really tough sell to get them to spend any amount of money over and above that. As a quick aside, if you ever do use open source projects and enjoy them, chuck some donations at their creators. It's the only way that open source continues to work. But anyways, to summarize everything, I don't think Games Workshop is in any danger from 3D printers just yet, but I think their panic about them is justified. The question isn't will 3D printers wipe out the miniature sales, the question is when will the 3D printers wipe out their miniature sales. As for what result is most likely when that happens, I honestly have no idea what Games Workshop management is doing, so I have no idea how they'll react. If they get a good long lead time, I do expect that they will adapt and survive. But if it happens in the next couple of years that 3D printer starts to wipe them out, I honestly do think that they're likely to crash and burn, and I do expect someone else will come in to scoop up the rights in an auction. Now, do you agree with my assessments? Disagree with them? Did I miss an alternative options? Let me know down in the comments. However, please also let me know down in the comments whether you do or don't 3D print your miniatures currently. I am curious to know what the ratios look like. As always, I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me though, and I can't wait to see you all in the next one. See ya!